Welcome to the Strong Women's Club, episode number 112.
This is the Strong Women's Club, where successful women share their behind-the-scenes stories of how they got to where they are today. Join us.
Hi, everybody. This is Edie Berg, and I am super happy that you are here with me today. Thank you very much for joining me. And usually my workflow is that I record the body of the interview a week or two or three ahead of the time that I actually publish the interview. But the intro and the outro, I record really close to the date of release so that I can talk about something relevant if I want to, or in something that's current is what I mean. In the podcasting world, this is sometimes a little bit under debate, mainly because podcasts are always available, and often people go back and listen to your older shows, even, just to find something that interests them. And then, of course, that podcast already is not current. It just isn't anymore. So as per usual for me, I like to do both. I stay current when possible, and I also record ahead of time when I need to. And so why do I need to now? Well, in Israel, this is what is known as the holiday season. And what that means is that we have Rosh Hashanah, New Year's, which is 2.5 days off of work. And then Yom Kippur, which this year fell on a Friday and Saturday, so it didn't really disrupt our routines. And now it's Sukkot, which is a 7-day holiday, which has 2 full holidays on each end of it. And in the middle, they're all like quarter days off, except for schools, which take the entire time off, plus extra days at the end for God only knows why. Mainly to make parents' jobs harder because they're at work, of course. And then the kids are on vacation. And the poor parents, we only just have recovered from 2 months of summer vacation. And now the kids have only been back to school for a couple of weeks before the chaos of these religious holidays started again. So it's really very crazy. And it's actually kind of hard, especially if parents are young kids. For me, it's much easier now because my kids are very independent. And my youngest is in 11th grade and all the others are, much older. They're not much older, but they're very independent. What happens usually here is that the grandparents are asked, or even if expected, to take over while the parents go to work. But, the grandparents also work and they also have lives and they can't take the kids for all the time and for not that entire time. So it's very hectic, and sometimes the holidays are kind of tainted by the feeling of what the heck are we going to do with the kids. And there are a lot of really very nice activities for kids all over the country, especially little ones. But the country's so small and crowded and chaotic, and the roads are so small and crowded and chaotic that it just takes so much time to get there. And then once you're there, it's just too crowded and chaotic, like I said. So my favorite pastime was always to go to the beach. It's still my favorite pastime. And the weather is always so beautiful this time of the year. It's really perfect. It's not too hot anymore. And the ocean is still warm. The water is warm and the swimming is sweet. So that's what I do with my kids on these days. I don't like to drive around the country and do extra things. And if they agree to actually come with me anywhere, then we go to the beach, have a picnic, and just hang out and swim and play. We play frisbee and we play ball games. We play matkot, which is this strange beach game that we play in Israel. And we take boogie boards to the ocean and just have a fun time. So that's what we're doing now. And that's why I am recording this a little bit ahead of time. And so let's get on to the program today. And today's guest is Janet Yassen. Janet Yassen helped to build the very first rape crisis center in Massachusetts, and she went on to become an international consultant of prevention of rape and sexual violence. And way back in 1972, she arrived to Boston and she was already an activist in the civil rights movement and in the women's movement, and she joined a newly formed Rape Crisis Center and has been there ever since. And she helped to open the very first Boston area Rape Crisis Center. And we talk all about how she did that and how, if you want to start something now, how did people do it then and what can you learn from that? And she became a social worker, of course, and over time, she shifted her focus sort of from sexual violence response to prevention. And she worked both with the victims and with the perpetrators to better understand the context and the causes of sexual violence. We talk about that also. She also became an international consultant in places such as Israel here and also the former Yugoslavia. She was in Belfast and in Japan and in Canada and in The Hague. And she was even honored at the 2003 Women Who Dared event in Boston. So let's hear Janet Yessen's story now. Janet Yassen, thank you for coming into the Strong Women's Club podcast. It's a pleasure to have you here with me today.
Thank you.
Let's start when you can think of a time when you first started being able to call yourself an activist.
Well, I think actually there are three things that come to mind as I'm just kind of pondering that question. The first is when I went to Jewish summer camp. So I started going to camp when I was 11. I went to Camp Ramah in the Poconos. Camps Ramah are the Jewish camps from the conservative movement.
Okay.
And there are several of them across. And I went to Poconos. We went to a small town called Lacombe, Pennsylvania. And I think the part of the culture, value system of the camp was to be connected to the community in which we were located. So we actually helped out doing things in the community that needed to be done. Mm-hmm. So I think that from an early age, I was taught about the interconnectedness of communities to each other and how we have to look out for each other. So it's not just Jewish centered, but it's whoever really needs support and help to kind of pitch in. So that's, I think, one thing that I'm thinking was sort of my foundation and part of what my DNA really was made up of. And then the second thing is that's related to that is I grew up in a very working class family. And so we couldn't afford for me to go to summer camp. So my synagogue gave scholarships, and my mom was a very big advocate for me to get the financial help. So I think she also kind of role modeled.
So could you tell me how it came to be when you started the Rape Crisis Center in Massachusetts?
Sure. So right after I graduated college, my friend Miriam and I, who went to college in Philadelphia, we lived at home. And she had a car. So as soon as we graduated college, we drove in her car north. We had friends in Boston, and Boston actually is a very similar place to Philadelphia. It has some history. It's small. It's manageable. So and this was in 1970. No. Well, anyway. Yeah, something like that. And the 70s were really the tail end or the height of the 60s movement. So we benefited from the women's movement. And the first thing I did when I got to Boston was go to the Cambridge Women's Center. And at the time, there were women gathering to form this thing called a Rape Crisis Center. So I wanted to be in something that was from the ground floor up. So I started joining in on the meetings, which were a collective. And for those of you who are too young to know what a collective is, it's a group of people that operates by consensus. So every decision had to be by consensus. So that means that every piece of mail we received had to be handed to each person, and we had to have input. So I'm not sorry that method of decision making is not in my life anymore, but it was powerful just in terms of learning how to create something. I mean, I was young, and for all of you, the listeners out there, I just so value and appreciate the sort of naivete of young people, but also the unbridled passion that young people can really bring. We thought we could do anything, and we did. I'm very proud that, I was part of that endeavor. It's the only rape crisis center that has continued to today. It was the second one in the United States. The first was in DC, and this one is still continuing. But we were part of a collective, and there was nothing at the time around sexual assault and domestic violence. So we just got these ideas and we made it happen with the generosity of our own spirit, of the community. It was just an amazing time. And it also, again, when you think about the feminist movement in the context of civil rights movement and what was going on in the country, I think if there wasn't all of that social upheaval and social questioning and consciousness, I don't think we could have done it. And, just on our own. And I think that's the really important thing that continues to reverberate in my life and through social activism now is to not do this alone.
Mm.
So
So
does that answer your question?
Yes, it does, but it brings more questions. So let's get into more in depth into this the center that you built and the people that it helped, and the kind of how did you get the word out about the center, and how did you break the taboos around women being able to come to you?
Right. Well, I think that there are always allies and there are always brave souls. So finding those allies and brave souls is, I think, part of community organizing that might not be called finding brave souls, but that's really what I would call it, because there were two aspects. One was the Sanchez family. And they were just random people in the Cambridge area. We wanted to have a telephone number that was easily remembered. So we wanted obviously the area code was 617, and we wanted something that ended with rape. So it would be 617, then the beginning exchange, and then 7273. And the telephone company said, well, we could, but everybody already had those numbers with the beginning numbers. So if we could get somebody to give their number up, then that would be fine. So I don't remember who it was. Could have been me. It could have been anyone. The memories start converging. But we called, several families or several people who had those numbers, and the Sanchez family said, oh, sure, we'll happily give our number to this. So that's how we got 617-492 rape. So that was the ally kind souls just asking for what you want and throwing a large net. And something is usually, it can be caught in the net, and just notice that you're catching things. So that was the allies. And the allies, well, I'll go back to that in a minute. But then the courageous souls has to do with, again, just sort of throwing your net out. So we kind of just, advertised, and, we're a very big college town, so we let college campuses know. And then we got a call.
Right. So what happened? Tell us the story of that first call.
So the first caller, I can say her name because she's kind of identified herself as our first caller, was Dolores. And she just said that she had been sexually assaulted by this random guy who she met in the Boston Common. And this friend of hers, told her about the Rape Crisis Center, and she called. And, as Dolores will tell the story, she says I was the answerer. Could have been. I mean, I appreciate the honor that she thought that I was the first, that I was the first person who answered the hotline and that I helped her. But I think she would describe it as, the first time that she felt like she wasn't going crazy and that she was believed. Now, the reality is none of us really knew anything about what we were sort of doing. And I think that taps into what I have incorporated as important lessons for beginner therapists and beginning hotline people, is to just tap into the humanity of what you're listening to and just lead with that. And the sort of techniques and skills that are relevant will follow, but that's really the most important thing. So I think I learned from that call to really build on that basic concept of humanity, dignity, and respect, which is really important in terms of sexual assault and any kind of interpersonal violence or any kind of violence, because that's what's taken away from the person is their lack of control of the situation, but that the person who's committing the violence doesn't really see them as human or having humanity. So that was Dolores and my, first encounter. And then the other thing around the publicity, has to do with really working hand in hand with community organizations. Again, so we can't do it alone. And there's so many levels of sexual assault. There's criminal justice system, hospitals, etc. So it was really sort of going out and slowly finding the allies in each of those settings. And there were none at those. I mean, that's not that there weren't allies. We didn't know who they were. And they wouldn't call themselves allies. But there was no one at the time. There were no victim advocates or anything like that.
So how did it work? If once they called in, or how does it even work? Once they called in, did they come to you? Did they come to a place, an actual physical place, or what was it?
So there are many roads inward.
Okay.
And it really is up to the person what she or he needs or wants. So the hotline is anonymous.
Okay.
So you can choose to identify or not identify. Right. And I think that's really important. I know actually, as I've done training at different rape crisis centers in different places in the world, including Israel, the anonymity is really important because oftentimes the sexual assaults occur between people who know each other, or the survivor, him or herself, is really sorting out sort of what this means to them. So they need to be in control of the conversation, how forthcoming they are, and how interconnected they want to be with the therapist or the hotline caller. And, because sometimes it's really dangerous for people to be, to really
to come straight out.
To come straight out with who they are. Like if I think about Israel or other situations, they could be put in danger in their communities, or if they're outed, about what happened to them. Also, when I think about some of my work in Israel, and so say, an Arab woman called a Jewish hotline, that would also not necessarily be accepted in her community. So, at least it was in the old days. And unfortunately, I think it's gotten back to that, but that's a separate story. So anyway, to keep the safety and the control with the caller.
Okay.
So,
and then they could come in to talk to somebody and to have support if they wanted to.
They can come in one-to-one. And now at the Rape Crisis Center, they also have legal advocates and housing advocates. So it's, to make, people safe, community safe, but also to be able to make changes if they need to, like with their locks, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the other thing I want to say about the services is that we also started groups right from the beginning. So survivors could be with each other and support each other. And that's a really important part of the healing process, is not just doing it alone, but to have the support of others.
Who have been in similar situations.
Yeah, and to see that, the stigma or the shame or the guilt or whatever you're feeling, you can see in another person that, oh, well, this person wasn't responsible for that. Why would I even think that, I was stupid, or how could I trust that person? So they can sometimes, people can see it in others and not in themselves. And that's
a good point.
Yeah, and that's really the other thing that I've learned through the years, sort of nourishes me. And I think that that's the other part about sort of being an activist and continuing to be active, which is that, we have to continue to be nourished. So,
generally speaking, I guess, I'm wondering how women recover. Is it only women, or is it also men?
It's definitely also men. And we used to, in the United States, we've had certainly over the decades, this awful really blot in our country. It's not just this country, around clergy sexual abuse. So, and that was primarily boys and men, boys. So, and I think that that's where the activism comes in. So from the very beginning, and I also, as I continue to do this work, really identifying these issues as gender-based violence. It's not just, power and control. It's really gender-based violence. And what that means is that even when it is either, male on male, it has nothing to do with sexual orientation. It has to do with control. And it has to do with really emasculating a person. So the worst thing you can do is have them be quote receptive and not have power in their lives and being able to fight back. So it's taking the qualities of women and using them as a form of degradation. So, like, when we've been learning about, say, the sexual assaults in the Congo, men being, adult men being sexually assaulted, it's really to, quote, emasculate them. So it is a very gender-based violence action and crime that, even though the men are the survivors, it's really based on powers and subordination. And that's also very deeply rooted in feminism.
And then how do people, I'm wondering how you bring people, not recover. How do they return to be able, I know this is like saying the Torah on one leg, really, but when you're standing on one leg, but
yeah, sure.
But recover to become, in intimate relationships again.
Right. So I think it happens over time. And actually, I mean, this is a little as an aside. I did actually an interview with a man by the name of Dan Savage. Have you heard? Oh, so yeah, sure. I did a thing on his radio show about, and a caller had called about, she was 6 months post-rape and she had a boyfriend and was wondering about sexual intimacy. And so that was part of what, that's sort of embedded in your question. So I think the first step, there are many different stages, but the first step is to get control over your own mind, body, spirit, and to make sure that you are safe and feel that you're getting the physical care and the emotional care and the spiritual care that you need, and that those around you are supportive. So, there's many prongs to the recovery process. There's the person, and then there's their circle. So helping she or he expand their circle out, and helping a person understand for themselves that rape is a form of control and it's not a form of sexual intimacy. So if, the example I like to use is that if you take a frying pan and you hit someone over the head with it, you don't call that cooking.
That's a good way of showing.
So so I think that just as people, it's a very intimate violation. It's a really intimate violation. Mm-hmm. And so to really, and vulnerability is a very key place. So to really help people reclaim step by step the separation between the acts of control and sex as a weapon versus the intimacy in the context of loving and caring relationships. Mm-hmm. And it happens slowly, but also, over time. I think that people have different points in their lives that it gets stirred up. I mean, you're a different person afterward. Or if it happens over the course, if it's a, early childhood sexual abuse, it could happen, over years. Mm-hmm. So I think that as someone, depending on how old you are and what your life experience was before, different touch points will happen at different points in your life. So if you were, say, 20 when you got sexually assaulted, if you have a daughter or son who is, 20, that can activate your memory. So it happens over time. I'm working with a woman now who was, brutally sexually assaulted and physically assaulted also by her father over time since early childhood. And she's in her 60s now. And then her father died. So sort of the grief and mourning and what got stirred up as a result of his death is another touchstone. So just to let people know that it's not the same right after, but that things go on and will bubble up, and not to be surprised or ashamed or feeling like they're moving backwards. So that's a long answer.
That's a good point. No, it's good. We have time. And it's that's the pleasure of a podcast, as you can do whatever you want. So after, how long were you where you were there?
Well, I do like to say that I'm the longest lasting, oldest rape crisis center volunteer on the history of the planet. So it started, we actually opened our hotline in March of 73. We started organizing in September of 72.
Mm.
And I still do some things periodically. So, and I've done everything at the Rape Crisis Center: hotline, groups, one-to-one, guerrilla theater, court advocacy, everything except get paid.
Okay. And now, what do you do with most of your time now? Now you're do the therapy most of the time.
Well, I'm actually the coordinator of victim services at the Victims of Violence program, acute crime services at the Victims of Violence program at Cambridge Health Alliance, which is a department of psychiatry that's connected to the Harvard Medical School. And so I've been with the Victims of Violence program since 1985. So I do direct service there around acute trauma. So it's not just sexual assault, it's any kind of ways that human beings find to hurt each other. And, I've been doing this, as you know, since 1972, so many, many decades. And I don't think there's like a week or at least a month that goes by that I don't hear about awful ways and new creative ways that people find to hurt each other.
So how does this affect you? Do you think how all these years of hearing these stories? I know, a person changes. Things must go through you to be able to be a good therapist.
Right.
So maybe you can tell us a story about that or something. How do you feel about it?
Yeah. Well, I think that is a really important point. And I think that soon after even like a year or two after I started the Rape Crisis Center, I've been doing the work. People said, how can you keep on doing this? Isn't it depressing? Blah, blah, blah. So I wrote about it like early on, and there were several things that came to mind. One was I learned knitting. I learned how to knit, and that got me through many hours of collective meetings as learning how to knit. As we discussed whether we should take money from Playboy magazine for the hotline, just so, is there clean money, dirty money, what difference between pornography and erotic art, so many hours of discussion and very interesting discussions. But anyway, I learned how to knit.
What was the knitting for you? The knitting was calming you, or
it was calming. It was very productive. It was something that I could actually do. I could also space out. So when I do a lot of teaching around what's called secondary trauma. So that's the trauma that you experience by doing some of the work. And for people who have a trauma history themselves, what can get activated by just continuing to do the work. I think that over the years, I try to practice what I preach, which is to have a balanced life.
What do you mean?
Well, to have good boundaries between work and not work, even though, since violence in the world is so prevalent, it's not, you can't, it's not like if you are phlebotomist or something, you take blood and that's it. But because, I live in the world and in the community, it's sometimes hard to set boundaries. But especially if you're doing one-to-one work, it's important to have social activism to realize that you're not alone and that you're doing things to make conditions better. So the social activism is important, to have balance, which means creative outlets, to have fun, to connect with nature. And then I think for me, I'm in a lot of support groups. So I'm in a mother's group. I'm in a meditation group, which is a separate thing that I'll just comment about in a minute. And then I'm also in a group of women whose focus is on getting older. So to find emotional and supportive outlets. So that's another aspect. But I guess the other thing is that I've ventured into is, as I'm getting older, is the spiritual domain. So I've always been involved. I'm Jewish, and so I'm very lucky that I have the Jewish year life cycles to really pause and to connect with nature and with something larger than myself and community. So to find intentional places to do that, even, you don't have to have a religion to do that. But also as you move through life, finding things that provide meaning for you. So, as I was dealing with people so daily and broadly who are suffering and who are powerless. So I was dealing with people that, in this country, we don't really help people with social services. Housing is really a problem, and people are taken advantage of. We have refugees, we have asylees. So we have people who are really suffering from many dimensions, and there's just so much you can do. There's not a lot you can do about many things. So from that, I really had to learn how to sit with and face my own powerlessness. So that's really led me even further in the spiritual domain. So I actually have been trained as a chaplain. So I think there is chaplaincy in Israel that's kind of a new field that's growing in Israel. But chaplains, and for Jewish people, they don't, chaplains are kind of an enigma about what that is. And it has sort of a Christian twang to it. So, I often, if I see a patient who's Jewish and I say I'm a chaplain, I have to explain what that is. But it's really helping people to access their own spiritual domain. So that was really, I think, a gift of doing this work was, really facing my own powerlessness and helping me to find some avenues to create more outlets for dealing with powerlessness.
With what you do. And you were going to tell me about the meditation group. I'm very interested in that.
So I've been meditating since, 1978. And that was also an exciting part about being in the 70s. Right. So a lot of the Eastern was coming to the West, and there was flowing East and West. So I think I was pregnant with my first child when I went to my first meditation retreat, or maybe it was before that. It was before I got married, when I was like freaking out, like, oh my God, how can I get married? There's no gay marriage. Am I going to be in a heterosexual marriage? I was doing the whole thing. So I went to my first meditation retreat, and it really took, because also it really, for me, in doing this work, it would help me to just manage the hurricane, since we're just having hurricanes here in the United States. Those are the images that come to mind for me. But the hurricane of emotions and thoughts, and knowing really at an early age, I think I went to my first meditation retreat when I was maybe like 28 or something. Just realizing that in order to survive and be with sort of what comes up in life, that it would help me to kind of step back from my own self. If you're an astrology person, I'm a Scorpio, so I have a lot of things in Scorpio. So my friend who's an astrologer tells me that that's pretty serious. A lot of drama.
I don't really know much about it. It could be, but I just don't know very much about it. So, but so now, for example, nowadays, what meditation do you do? How often do you do it? What does it look like?
So it's a very integral part of my life. And I do what's called Vipassana meditation, and that's, basically just following your breath. I also do mindfulness practice, which is less connected to a sort of an Eastern practice. But, I think I was drawn to Vipassana after I did a stint with Muktananda. That's another whole story. I went to an ashram in the Catskills that had been a hotel, where Jackie Mason was a stand-up comic, and now it was this ashram. So anyway, that's a different story. But then I followed Vipassana, which is the insight meditation. And so the founders were Sharon Salzberg, Joseph Goldstein, Jack Kornfield, and Sylvia Bornstein. So you get the theme.
Right.
And you didn't have to change your name. You didn't have to remember a mantra. So I was really more drawn to that. So I do go to retreats. I still go to retreats. And I continue to practice regularly. And I also, as part of the Cambridge Health Alliance, we have a Center for Mindfulness and Compassion. So I've been teaching mindfulness practices to patients through that. And now I actually...
Do they find it helpful? Do you think, do you see...
yeah.
And it's easy for them to adopt? I mean...
Well, I don't call it meditation or mindfulness. I mean, just to give you an example, I now start every session with, especially patients that I know. It is always with patients I know, not new patients, but we start every session with just pausing and making a transition from like the waiting room or whatever I was doing. We just get in the room together and we just take a moment to gather ourselves, to just be inside of our own bodies and just notice our minds, our thoughts without judgment and letting it go, and just extending that awareness to the room, to the two people, to the light, to the air, to the sounds, and doing the best we can to open our hearts to whatever comes up in our meeting together. So that just takes a couple minutes, and I think it settles both of us down.
Right.
And then it also allows, so sometimes people, if you haven't been in therapy yourself, you go, oh, this is what, I want to talk about this. I want to make sure I talk about that. But when you stop and you pause and, you're just kind of gathering yourself, something can bubble up that's actually more relevant than the list of things that you thought you wanted to talk about.
That makes sense.
And then the other part of that is, part of my therapy practice is something called internal family systems, which is another whole story about what that method is. But that method involves us being in touch with the parts of ourselves that are either managers or are very dramatic, and those parts are called firefighters. But that underneath it all, there's something called self-energy. And so that's sort of like the neshama or the Buddha nature. So under everything, it's like under the torment of the oceans, there's something, when you go deeper, there's something sort of peaceful and wise. And so just pausing to, and everyone has that, no matter how many psychological problems they have, everyone, I believe, has that inner wisdom, and given time, space, and the connection to others, we can access that. So that's where my meditation practice is sort of eclectic and I think universal. And actually, this is not actually a plug for this, but just an example of this. So tomorrow, around, I don't know whether it's around the country, but certainly around this area and in Cambridge, which is like the People's Republic of Cambridge, Massachusetts, there's something called Parking Day. So that means that there 120 parking spots are being taken over. Talk about social activism. This is like, all the streams of my life coming together. So we're going to be on the street taking over parking spaces. And I'm part of a little group that's going to be doing mindfulness practice in these a little
parking spot
tomorrow in the middle of Harvard Square.
Wow,
so
fantastic! I love that area.
Yes, it's beautiful.
It's I lived there for a couple of years also. So, what are the other parking spots doing?
I think they're selling things, like herbs and things, and I think they're publicizing, some of the different activities that are going on in Cambridge. You can go on parking spot Cambridge, 2015, September 15th, 2015. All the different ones, 120 of them. So, I think it'll be really fun and exciting.
It is fun.
Just to, so it sort of really brings together sort of just my value system and just sort of taking over the streets of Cambridge. We used to have to take back the night marches, so now we're having to take back the parking spaces.
Parking.
Yeah. I don't know where I'm going to park my car. That's my big one.
Yeah. The whole problem with traffic and cars and roads and all that is.
So let me just say one other thing about the way my strands of life kind of interweave, like Hala, as we're coming up to Rosh Hashanah, is that I do mindfulness practice with police officers as well. So my colleague has a whole, program called MindFit, and we're going to try to be doing it with police officers and some of the victim advocates. This country, and I don't think that this country is unique, but I think police are specifically on high alert. They always have to be on high alert because there's danger everywhere. But especially now when there's such division in our country and such strife, there's a lot more reactivity, and mindfulness practice allows you not to be less aware, which is, really important for people to know and understand. And actually creates more awareness, but in a lighter way. So, you can actually make better decisions. So now there's my plug for mindfulness. You asked me if I was talking anything. There we go. Mindfulness for all, and all for mindfulness.
That's perfect. I think it's a perfect place to finish up for today. Okay. We could talk for a long time, but I'll be mindful of your time and let you get on with your day. But thank you so much for coming into the Strong Women's Club podcast. It's such a pleasure to meet you and to hear about the important work that you've been doing, and to have you on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janet Yassen, for coming onto the show and for the amazing, incredible work you have done and continue to do. Next week, I will be at Biz Chicks Live in Irvine, California as the MC, the Master of Ceremonies, and I am also participating in the conference, and we'll definitely do a podcast of all of the content and my experiences there. I am super excited, I must admit. For the entire event, I have my cocktail dress ready, my business clothes are ready, and I am raring to go. Also, if you are a businesswoman in the sports industry somehow, or in the health and wellness in corporations, that's what your work is, or you study sports mindset, please contact me. I want to talk to you about possibly being on the podcast. Okay, everybody, have a wonderful week. I wish you health and strength. Litroot.